Good morning, everyone. We're already a few minutes late, so we're going to get started with the first panel. And today, the panel is about cultural imperialism in knowledge production, classification, and preservation in the Middle East and North Africa region. We have three presenters: Jamila Ghaddar, who's an assistant professor at the School of Information Management at Dalhousie University. Mahdi Ganjavi, who is a PhD student at the Department of Leadership, Higher and Adult Education at the University of Toronto in Canada. And Blair Koons, who's the Near and Middle Eastern Studies librarian at the University of Toronto Libraries. And I believe Blair is going first. Oh, okay. So Jamila is coming first, and she's going to talk to us about archival repatriation and placement in the Middle East and North Africa, the Vienna Convention for Global Archival Decolonization.
Thank you. I'll be confusing there quite a bit, right? Just keeping you on your toes. Good morning, everybody. I know this is a library association, but when I saw the CFP, I saw some room to sneak in here a little bit of archival talk. And I'm just wondering, some folks in the room do archiving or work with special collections, just to get an idea of, yeah? Yeah, so, okay, great, we're good. We're on the same page in terms of things. So what happened, can you cue me when I have 5 minutes left? I think it's 15 we're doing, right? Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to be fairly quick. I'm just going to give you a general idea about, one of those big, complicated, colonial, dragged-on things. So this is just a little window into that, into a larger project I'm involved in with people all over the world, from the Namibia archives to the Caribbean to the Arab world, thinking about what happens with all the archives held by the colonial or former colonial or imperial states, especially when they were taken out with third world decolonization and the sort of period, around the Second World War and therefore. And so there are hundreds of cases where the colonizers took all the records with them as they were leaving the colonies on the eve of decolonization. So there's a big group of us who've been working about it and thinking about it, and I could talk a little bit more about that later, but I kind of want to start my story about how we ended up there, which was just like me being a PhD student. And I was at the University of Toronto, and I went to UNESCO. I wanted to do research on whatever, and I never did that research in the end. Because what happened was just something surprising. As I was reading the records by the thousands, obsessively, from the moment the archives opened to the moment it closed, over weeks, I started realizing that there was a story in the records at UNESCO about something called the Vienna Convention, which I had never heard about, and which almost nobody had ever heard about. And as part of that, I, understood that as I was understanding what the convention was and how it emerged, I was also tracing a fairly massive and quite powerful conspiracy to eradicate, hide, and disappear the convention. Based out of primarily the French National Archives, but also with the British, and also with and also with the bodies like UNESCO and the International Council on Archives. And that's because there was something really startling about the Vienna Convention. And this is, of course, something I've written a little bit about in this chapter, if you want to get any sort of proof or evidence about some of the pretty broad claims I'm making in this short presentation. And there is also an Arabic translation that's coming out to print soon. If you want, I can bring that to you. So as part of realizing that the Vienna Convention for, its actual names usually with all laws pretty clunky. It's the Vienna Convention on Archives, Property, and Debt with Succession of States, passed in 1983, and it never receives the required signatures to go into law. And that's maybe a story I'll come back to. But this was, a convention that at a fundamental level called for the full repatriation of all colonial archives. and the eradication of all colonial debt, and the full repatriation of all property taken during the colonial period out of the country. And so you can see that was pretty amazing to me as a PhD student to realize such a thing existed. And I decided that I would shift to kind of unburying it and unburying all those, global South ghosts that were haunting me as I was going through this at the UNESCO archives. And especially, it had a huge involvement by the Arab wing of the Third World Bloc at UNESCO. It's an official bloc of the United Nations at that time. And Dr. Mohammed Badjoui from Algeria was a huge part of it. And so, we started, I called up some people, and in the end, the first time that the convention was publicly spoken about was at the ICA Rome Convention, and that took some wrangling. There was a lot of pushback from the French archivists. They didn't want us to talk about it. And then from there, there's been chapters, panels, other different classrooms, virtual events, and now people are talking about the convention all over the place, people who don't know me and I don't know them. So I just think it's really fantastic, because what we can see from that uptake is that the Vienna Convention, although it never came into force because of this kind of power dynamic between North and South, has people recognize right away the tremendous richness, theoretically, judicially, and in terms of normative mechanisms for dealing with disputed archives. And I'm going to tell you why that's the case. But just to very quickly emphasize that what the convention really comes out of is that period of third world global decolonization, where you have a tremendous shift in state sovereignties, the post-colonial conundrums, all the sort of issues and problems of having these kind of liberatory, things like even liberation movements within a global Western-dominated system of states, Algerian liberation movement and the Namibian liberation movement dedicated an unbelievable amount of time and resources to get the convention passed. This went on over years through multiple sites, the Arab League, the non-aligned movement, all sorts of global South sites and actors and institutions over decades. There are thousands of archival records, all full of rich theory about law and archives and repatriation, and all of which had been buried. And so you see that tone and that feeling and that sense of that period in the convention. And you also see similarly its limitations, which is its state focus. And I'll come back to that. And as part of that, of course, the convention was actually crucial, as a crucial component of the calls for a New World Information Communication Order, which a lot of you may have heard more about, and a New World Economic Order. And while the one, NWECO, called for equity in the global information flows and communications flows, the other one, New World Economic Order, was looking for people-centered development and a way to kind of deal with the debt legacy of the colonial period. And so you can see both these preoccupations all coming together in the convention. And I say that to emphasize that the convention, with all its potential and limitations, was always part of and designed as part of a much broader project of all-sided decolonization, which is yet to be realized, and which we continue to strive for, and which there's a kind of latent potential to the convention in that relation. So what's so, and the convention, I keep forgetting I have slides, all right? Like all this period, non-aligned. This is what happens when you're trying to navigate a microphone. It's okay. We'll do the best. And so here you have also all these other cultural, heritage, archival site things that you've probably heard of, but I don't know if it's ever made clear that the Third World Bloc at UNESCO and NAM were leading these kinds of efforts, and that, again, the Vienna Convention exists within this attempt to reclaim, repatriate, defend, protect, recontextualize cultural, social, material heritage in the wake of decolonization at the political level, the state level. And all of this is evident in the preamble of the Vienna Convention. First off, it's talking about decolonization. First off, it's talking about economic sovereignty. Right from the bat, it contextualizes the question of archives within this third world moment, much of which we continue to have to deal with. And you have some of the things like this article, which is part of, I put on the screen. I'm not going to read it, but I'll emphasize something that's remarkable about the convention, which is it's retroactive. That means it pertains to any and all archives taken by colonizers at any period in time, regardless of the fact that it was created in 1983. So it doesn't only move forward. It moves back to the 500 years of Euro-American imperialism. And so part of the other parts of the convention that are worth highlighting is that, and I'm going to focus on the archives part, don't have time to talk about the dead property part, but they're all very interesting. So part of the thing about this as well, these articles that's significant, is that it presents archives of decolonizing states as completely distinct from any other form of state succession. And it accords greater rights in terms of archives reputation when colonialism was a factor than, for example, when you have state succession because of the dissolution of a union, or when you have state succession because of an amalgamation. But where colonialism was a factor, the convention presents articles and a judo-legal framework that emphasizes unique and greater rights arise because of that history of oppression and so on. And then at the same time, so this is where the subsection is, specifically on newly independent state. And part of that is saying that whatever comes into effect with this convention, wherever there is a return of archives from the former colonizer to the newly decolonized state, it happens for all archives ever taken out of the country, for all archives taken by the colonizer from the country, and for all archives about the colony created even in the metropolis. So that is actually a really large mandate. And in that regard, it says that then the transfer of those archives from the metropole, the colonizer, to the former colony, the newly decolonized state, it entails the complete extinguishment of the right of the former colonizer to any and all aspects of those records, which is also quite remarkable. And as part of that, it creates an impetus on the former colonizer to spend resources to help the newly independent country regather any and all records taken out of the country during the colonial period, even if it wasn't taken out by the colonial state. That they have a responsibility to that they didn't protect that while they were colonized. They have to return it. And, I think it's already quite remarkable. What I would highlight with the few minutes I have left is that for us archival scholars and practitioners, it becomes very important that this convention articulates a fundamental, not shift, but a fundamental elaboration at a profound level of key concepts and frameworks in archival science that go all the way back to the French Revolution. And those are the notion of retroactive sovereignty, the notion of territorial origin, and the notion of functional pertinence. Archival science speak. But basically what it means is that if you are colonized, you to get independence, you have then retroactive sovereignty on all the records before. This is a principle that originates in Europe during the period after the French Revolution. Same with territorial origin, that records should return to the territories from which they originate from, which I also elaborate to mean records about territories should also be returned to those territories. That's where the convention takes it further. And functional pertinence, fancy archives speak that if you need something in order to function as a state, if you need records in order to function, then you should also have them. These are all concepts that have, again, a history in Europe. They were applied in Europe to resolve disputes between European powers in the context of wars and colonial occupations. But then with Third World decolonization, they decided to completely stop doing that, completely abandon that legal tradition because they didn't want to apply it for people outside of the white nations. So there's a lot of other solutions, like specific mechanisms for what to do in the convention that I don't have time to get into, but I just want to highlight that there's some specific ways in which processes are laid out and different kinds of resolution mechanisms. So I've argued that this whole kind of way of conceptualizing the origin and meaning of archives gives rise to a notion of provenance in place. The dominant notion in archival science since about the French Revolution is that provenance as in origin, as in ownership, as in the most important thing about a record and the most important thing in archival science is provenance, is always attached to the creator of the records. And therefore the creator, the British government, has right to ownership. And therefore, all the records are gathered and described and arranged, and everything about the records centers on the British government. But in the convention and within the various declarations and so on coming out of indigenous data sovereignty movement, as we scan these whole kind of range of things, we see a disruption, a challenge, a dislodging of the creator as the center, and instead, where place and territory becomes the center. And that has huge ramifications for anyone working with any kinds of archives, but again, I can't quite get into that. So what does that mean very quickly for the famous case of Algeria? We know that there's this huge
you need to wrap up.
between Algeria and France over the records that France took with decolonization as the French settler colonial power was leaving. It actually means that Algeria is not asking for enough. Firstly, the convention says categorically that those records they took, the hundreds and thousands of records they took as they were leaving Algeria, forced out of Algeria, those, according to the convention, must be returned at the expense of France immediately, and France has absolutely no rights to them, no rights to copy, to access to anything. But it also says, which the French government, the Algerian government isn't even asking for, is that Algeria has the right to any and all records created in France, anywhere, about administrating Algeria. And that also then the French government has no right to those records whatsoever. And furthermore, it says that France must pay for and help find and repatriate all the records, archives that were taken out of Algeria when it was a French settler colony, even if it wasn't the French government who did that. Even now, because we have this problem where lots of French citizens and have these personal collections that are taken in these, with Iraq. And it's same. I don't have time, so I won't go into it too much, but in terms of Iraq, you could see similarly that the British and the French would have to return things, and also in that whole same way. Unfortunately, I did not have time to talk about Palestine, which is really unfortunate. Of course, Palestine is on many of our minds with the horrific Israeli genocide, onslaught that's taking place right now. And given the fact that we have an open ethnic cleansing while the world stands by, while our government has now sent troops, while there's massive attempts at censorship, while. So I wanted to, at least say that. What I will say in the case of Palestine, which has been subject to relentless destruction, plunder, theft, and hiding of archives and records and so on, is that in order to make it possible for us to extend those principles of the Vienna Convention, which center on states, to the context of the Palestinian people who don't have a state in this moment, we then have to bring things like the Adelaide Declaration and the United Nations Declaration on Indigenous Rights. And by bringing these two documents together, as I'm working with people here at the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation in terms of Indigenous nations in Canada, by bringing these two together, we have a much more robust framework to mobilize the principles and frameworks of the Vienna Convention to people who are stateless. So, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this enlightening talk. And now I'm calling Blair Kuntz, who will talk to us about cultural imperialism and Library of Congress subject headings on the Middle East. Blair?
Okay. So, wish I'd gone first, because now I have to follow Jamila. I don't think I'll be as charismatic. But anyways, I'll go on, because we only have 15 minutes to go. So this paper is a continuation of my paper entitled Arabic Librarians Talk Back to the Empire, which was presented at the Middle Eastern Libraries Conference, MELCOM, in Sarajevo in 2007. That paper described how the Library of Congress subject headings on the Middle East, which purport to be neutral, but are not neutral, but in fact reflect the views of the American government and the State Department and act as a hegemonic propaganda tool. Thus, in LCSH, American and American allied invasions are termed wars, occupations become interventions, massacres become battles. Meanwhile, such obfuscating terminology is not reserved for American adversaries or perceived enemies, whose actions are described as occupations, invasions, and massacres. This paper expands on the older paper by introducing Edward Said's concept of cultural imperialism when he states, "The power to narrate or block other narrators from forming and emerging is very important to cultural imperialism and constitutes one of the main connections between them. Most important, the grand narrators of emancipation and enlightenment mobilize people in the colonial world to rise up and throw off imperial subjection. In the process, many Europeans and Americans were also stirred by these stories and their protagonists, and they too fought for new narratives of equality and human community." The power to narrate, as Edward Said states, is one that is afforded to LCSH, and most library users most probably use LCSH without thinking of such hegemony, although most certainly more than a few have been offended by their biases. LCSH, however, functions much like the mainstream North American corporate and state news media informing opinion. As the scholar Michael Parenti noted in his book Inventing Reality in 1993, and this preceded Noam Chomsky's and Edward Herman's Manufacturing Consent. Well, he actually had this argument before them, I think. But he said, even if the press does not mold our every opinion, it does mold opinion visibility. It can frame the perceptual limits around which our opinions take shape. Here may lie the most important effect of the news media. They set the agenda for the rest of us, choosing what to emphasize and what to ignore or suppress, in effect organizing much of our political world for us. The media may not always be able to tell us what to think, but they are strikingly successful in telling us what to think about. So I think we can see that in the current moment when we're all watching the news and it looks like black is white and up is down, and we're in Alice in Wonderland when we're watching the mainstream corporate and state media from the Western world. So while the principle of library neutrality is professed to be an aspirational principle of the profession of librarianship, LCSH are not neutral and in fact represent the viewpoints of the American government, which after all funds the Library of Congress. LCSH has often been criticized for reflecting the elite dominant viewpoint of the European settlers who colonized the United States and committed genocide upon the indigenous people who live there. This viewpoint can be viewed in the LCSH Library of Congress subject heading, which uses the term massacre when indigenous people killed white European settlers. For example, this subject heading, the Warren Wagon Train Massacre, Texas, 1871, while using the term battle to describe, while using the term battle when European settlers killed indigenous Americans who were fighting for control of their land. So we have the Blue Water Creek Battle of Nebraska, 1855. As we shall see, this cowboy and Indians view of the world, the good guys versus the bad guys, the guys in the white hats versus the guys in the black hats, still informs American government foreign policy and, by extension, the Library of Congress subject headings. It is noteworthy, for example, that LCSH has refused to add the term white fragility as a subject heading. As singer-songwriter Tracy Chapman states in her song America, as she comments on the founding ethos of the United States, that is, the genocide of its indigenous peoples, you're still conquering America. Thus, when America's perceived enemies act in a way contrary to the interests of the American government, LCH is very clear. For instance, it says, Ukraine history, Russian invasion. The term invasion is used. That's all the way through in the used for. It's very clear Russia is the aggressor. They invaded. So, however, if we go on to Afghanistan history of Soviet occupation, 1979-1989, it's called an occupation. It's not called a war, and in fact, under international law at the time, Mahdi will be talking about this, but during the Cold War, the Afghani government, in fact, invited the Soviet Union to come in. And that is, under international law, that is a legal concept. It's not this rules-based order we're talking about. But you don't see that in the Library of Congress subject headings. The same is true, So when the Iraq War, we also see there's no term occupation. How long did the Americans occupy Iraq? I mean, they're still there. But do we see the term occupation anywhere in this? And I really like this, actually, because it has all these Orwellian Operation New Dawn Operation Iraqi Freedom Operation. It kind of shows you how sociopathic the whole thing is. Like, just looking at that, it's kind of like, how do they get these names for these things? Okay. So likewise, although the 20-year-old American occupation, not to mention the invasion that preceded it, lasted twice as long. It lasted 20 years. It didn't last 10 years like the Soviet Union. Another thing I should say about the Afghanistan, most people think, oh, well, as soon as the Russian troops left Afghanistan, that was the end. In fact, the government that was in place lasted until 1994, which was 4 years after the fall of the Soviet Union. So that's another thing to consider. Now, here, we only see the word war. So even though they were there 20 years, the Western powers and NATO were there 20 years, we don't see anything about an occupation. Isn't that strange? Like, how come it was a Soviet occupation, but this is not an occupation? It lasted twice as long, but we don't see that anywhere. And the other thing is, we've got this term, so as we see, I'll go on my paper. As in Iraq, therefore, LCSH's use of the term war to describe the American NATO occupation of the country serves to deny and cover up the many war crimes and atrocities committed during that war, including the drone strikes on wedding parties, the U.S. dropping of the mother of all bombs, the most powerful of the most conventional bomb ever used, and the withholding of $7.1 billion belonging to the Afghanistan Bank, when the American troops were finally forced to leave the country in 2021. Likewise, using the term Iraq War to describe an American occupation obscures the 1 million Iraqis estimated by the Lancet magazine to have died because of the American invasion, the human and environmental devastation caused by depleted uranium, and the sectarian division which divided the country following the invasion. It is also worthwhile noting that the British colonization and occupation of Afghanistan from 1838 to 1842 is simply described as Afghanistan history, British intervention. intervention, not occupation, 1838, 1842. So here we get to this heading, the War on Terrorism. So as you see in the scope note, it says, here are entered works on the events metaphorically referred to as a war, consisting of military operations, diplomatic activities, and other counter-terrorist measures undertaken by the United States during the period from September 11, 2001 to the end of the administration of George W. Bush. Works on government anti-terrorist measures and activities during earlier or later periods are entered under terrorism prevention. So what we have here is they use the term, it's a metaphorical, so they're not actually saying, maybe it seems to me they're trying to say, well, we don't actually agree that, with the term, but it's a metaphorical term. However, when the user looks up the record, what they see is war on terrorism. So it doesn't have quotation marks around it. So while the scope note clarifies that the use of the term war is metaphorical, this will not be apparent to the user who is forced to use the subject heading to find materials. This is especially true since the related terms for the general headings are Afghan War and Iraq War 2001. So you saw that in the two previous ones. I could go back. So, yeah, you see the war on terrorism. So it's a related term in Afghanistan. It's a related term in Iraq. So these are supposed to be part of the war on terrorism. Oh, sorry. So this despite the fact that most of the hijackers involved in 9/11, and it kind of confirms the fact that Afghanistan and Iraq were invaded in revenge for the Twin Tower attacks. But most of the hijackers were of Saudi nationality, and none held Iraqi or Afghan citizenship. So while the American government claimed it invaded Afghanistan because it wanted to find Osama bin Laden, the Afghani government actually said that they would turn over Osama bin Laden if the United States provided evidence that he was involved in it. So the use of the term, furthermore, the use of the term war on terror serves to mask the covert military training and support to religious fundamentalists in its proxy war against the Soviet Union, which the United States, and it also serves to mask what it really was, a war of terror, which the United States has waged against the rest of the world, including but not limited to the CIA mining of Nicaragua's harbors late in 1983, the downing of a Cuban passenger jet killing all people on board on October 6, 1976, the MELA massacre in Vietnam in 1968, and if we can believe the American journalist Seymour Hersh, which I think we can believe, the bombing of the Nord Stream pipeline. Okay. So I've only got 5 minutes, so I'm going to move quickly here. So I just wanted to show you here how the American governments and British governments, Margaret Thatcher, they supported South Africa. Israel also wanted to supply, they were willing to supply nuclear weapon secrets. This is probably one of the reasons why South Africa is not very fond of Israel when you hear South African leaders talk about Israel. However, when we look at the Library of Congress subject headings, what we see is it's actually, they're covering up. They seem to be covering up for the South African apartheid government. It's still there. So actually the first one I think is very interesting because it has participation Cuban, and actually, I think that's a badge of honor for Cuba because it actually helped to end South African apartheid. Well, the United States and Britain and various Western governments supported the South African regime. And then you'll notice it has these South African incursions. Like, what's an incursion? Isn't that an invasion? Like, why would you call this an incursion? So this is all just going back and looking, actually you can see in Library of Congress subject headings how they didn't cleanse them. So you can see the actual participation. So here I'm just looking at, so we have the Ukraine conflict in 2014 on. So do you see the word civil war there? It's nowhere to be seen. I mean, there was a civil war. It went on from 2014, and you could say it's continuing until today, until the Russian Russians came into Ukraine. But there's no civil war. Like, why is that? It's a cover-up. So if you look at these three subject headings, all of them which involved substantial Western intervention, in the case of Yemen, Saudi intervention and intervention by the United Arab Emirates, this is not a civil war. So the Yemen Republic, sorry, it has civil war. I didn't look at it closely enough, but it's a Yemen Republic civil war history, 2015. So when they use the term civil war in this case, it's a way of trying to mask what really happened in these places. It's trying to mask the Western intervention that caused so much violence and caused so much, starvation in Yemen, and caused, Libya to revert back to selling slaves. Slaves were being sold in Libya after the so-called Western NATO intervention. So I'm just going to end by showing some things that maybe how we can remedy having the Library of Congress subject headings trying to mask the harmful behavior. So we saw some of that in the OCLC presentation yesterday. So at our university, the younger people who've come on board, this is actually their initiative, but I really salute them for doing this. So this is the Indigenous Metadata Working Group. So they've gone to look at these pejorative terms like Indians of North America, Indians of Mexico. So they've suggested new terms for them. So instead of saying Eskimo, which is a very pejorative term, which the Library of Congress still uses. I mean, I really can't believe that after 200 years after committing genocide, they still have to use these. Like, they couldn't have changed this to these more respectful terms. So what happens in this case is that as an OCLC, you don't actually get rid of it from the record. You don't get the subject heading rid of, it still appears in the record, but when you look for indigenous peoples, if you want to use the more correct term, this will appear. Plus, if you use the pejorative term, it will bring in all of the terms. And I think there's actually a note saying we should use indigenous peoples instead of Indians of North America. So the other suggestion I have, and I don't know how far that will go, is to use another thesaurus from an Arabic country, for example, or a Persian. So, for instance, the difference between here on Palestine, if you notice here, we have the term disputed territories. That's directly from the Israeli government. That's the term. These lands are not disputed. Every year at the United Nations, there is a vote saying Israel should leave the occupied territories. So they are not called disputed territories. They're occupied territories. So if you look at the Arabic language, Qa'im al-Rus al-Mawdu'at al-Kubra from Egypt, you'll notice it's a very different explanation. There's no use of the term disputed territories. So it's very clear. So, my suggestion for that is perhaps we can start using the Arabic thesaurus. Like, why don't we start putting in the 655? Why can't we put, at least in Arabic script, another thesaurus? Now, I know that's going to involve a lot of, I don't think it will involve that much more effort, but it will be more effort and, it might cost more money. But I think that as a remedy for countering the harmful effects of the Library of Congress subject headings, it's a very good idea, in my opinion. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Blair. And so our last speaker for this session is Mahdi Ganjavi, who will present his paper entitled A Cold War History of Books and Knowledge Production in the Middle East, The Case of the Franklin Book Program. Mahdi, you're here?
So first, I'm it's same as what Blair mentioned. It's quite hard to follow Jamila with her charisma and Blair with all his own sites. Before going through this presentation, which would be a kind of a very broad overview of my recent book on Franklin Book Programs, which came out in 2023 by IB Tourist, I wanted just to note that probably my bio was very much outdated. It's the MELA, and I finished my PhD back in 2020, and currently I'm teaching actually at the Faculty of Information at University of Toronto. So the Franklin Book Program was a private non-for-profit organization which was founded in 1952 during the Cold War. During its height of operations, it actually had offices or was operating in around 17 countries in the world and at least in 3 continents. Initially intended to promote U.S. liberal bourgeois values and create markets for U.S. books in, quote, third world, end quote, countries, the FBP evolved into an international educational development program. It published university and school textbooks, developed printing, publishing, and book selling institutions, and trained local teachers as textbook writers. Additionally, the Franklin Book Program sponsored the publication of reading materials for children, teens, youth, teachers, and parents. It became one of the most significant international educational and book program organizations of the Cold War era. My book, that you can see its cover on the slides, explores the FBP's 25-year operation from 1952 to 1977 and its context within various U.S. international educational initiatives and policies developed during the 1950s to 1980s. I investigate the role that educational and technical assistantship programs played in the U.S. policy of containment after the end of World War II. This investigation extends to cover 3 decades of the Cold War rivalry between the capitalist and socialist blocs, including their international ideological and cultural manifestations. A critical investigation of the FBP's operations is a significant interdisciplinary contribution to the fields of comparative global education, book history, and print culture, and Cold War studies. So the research questions you can see for this book, you can see them on the slide. Using archival study and textual and historical analysis, this research answers the following questions. What were the social and political conditions that facilitated the establishment of the FBP? What were the cultural, educational, and political objectives of the FBP? And how did these goals inform and shape the FBP's structure and policies? How did it evolve in the course of its history in terms of scope and function? And then moving to specifically discuss the case of Iran and FBP's operations in Iran. How did the FBP affect Iranian education and textbooks? And why was the FBP most, to quote the FBP's board of directors statements, most successful, end quote, in Iran? And what role did the Iranian state play in this success? To do so, I've investigated several sources, and I've listed the primary sources here. Most important one, the corporate records of the FBP, which are held at the Princeton University Library's Archives of American Publishing, as well as the classified documents which are accessible through the National Security Archives, as well as the Cold War International History Project, 2 projects which are providing access to declassified documents. Certain documents from the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA archives, documents of the Psychological Strategy Board files, one of the earliest committees which were formed in early Cold War during Truman, and was one of the early attempts for United States to come up with a centralized doctrinal warfare. At the time, its documents nowadays are held at the Truman's Library. The archives of the Pahlavi regime's National Organization for Security and Intelligence, or SAVAK, as some of you might know, after the revolution of 1979, certain documents by Savak have been have become accessible by the post-revolutionary regime. The records of the U.S. Embassy in Iran, same issue after the occupation of the embassy by the student followers of the Imam line back in early days of the revolution. The documents at the embassy were confiscated, and they have become available selectively. However, sometimes with their translations through a specific historical institution sponsored by the state in Iran. And then finally, the published interviews with local staff, memoirs and reflections, as well as textbooks, translations and journals that were sponsored or produced by the Tehran branch. And just to give you a sense of the journals that I've gone through, I've studied 550 issues of the Peik magazines, which was a bi-weekly supplementary reading at the time produced as a collaboration between the Iran's Ministry of Education and the Tehran branch of Franklin. This slide shows the structure of the book. As you can see, I start with the international history of the Franklin Book Program, and in chapters 3 and 4, I discuss the origins and the policies and structures of the FPP, as well as come up with a historicization or periodization of the Franklin Book Programs based on my study of its archives. And then in the chapter 4 and 5, I move to study the case of Iran in details and discuss as well how it was the reactions to the Franklin Book Programs in Iran, especially the case of Jalal al-Ahmad and his theory, and how his theory of Stocksification was kind of influenced or was shaped as a result of his disillusionment with the Franklin Book Program in Tehran. So the Franklin Book Program was founded in 1952, along with other cultural enterprises financed by the Department of State during the Cold War era, such as the Congress for Cultural Freedom, CCF. It was established as a non-for-profit U.S. organization through collaboration between the Department of State, U.S. librarians, publishers, and educational leaders. Its objective was to bridge the gap in U.S. ideological penetration and knowledge production in third world and countries through commercial book distribution. The Franklin Book Program not only received the seed grant of $500,000 from the Department of State, but also benefited from clandestine assistance from U.S. missions in the FBP's countries of concern during the staff recruitment. Through the International Information Administration, IIA, which was founded back in 1952, the Department of State also guided the FBP in its publication and distribution of works, while the department considered creating, awareness, of the dangers of Soviet communism, a desirable ideological goal. An even more urgent ideological objective was the establishment of attitudes in third world countries toward close collaboration with the West. And here in the image, you can see, on the slide, you can see the image of some of the local managers of the Franklin Book Program back in 1971. The above-mentioned U.S. ideological goals in the Middle East influenced not only the content of the books published by the FBP, but also the policies and structure of the organization. The content of the FBP's sponsored titles aimed to present U.S. cultural life in a positive light. The FBP focused on different types of texts, including U.S. books promoting the American way of life, textbooks and reference works presenting non-communist political, social, and economic content, and trade books in an affordable format. All types of books targeted three possible levels of audience: first, university students and mid-level government officials; second those with a secondary education level, and third children and young adults. And in the next two slides, you can see images of the distribution of textbooks. In this image, textbooks printed by the FPP and being distributed in Bangladesh. And moving to its structure, in its terms of its structure, the FPP operated with three main structural rules. First, the operating offices of the FPP had to be staffed entirely by local nationals and not with any resident Americans, and frankly managed actually to follow this structure until kind of the latest years of its operation. And it was only late in 1970s that they were forced to change this. This was crucial as it was important for the FPP not to be seen as a propaganda tool linked to US Cold War interests. While the general policy of the US Cultural Cold War was clearly not to assist communists, nonetheless, the FPP's local branches recruited the staff from left-of-center groups. The endorsement of such a non-communist left enabled the FPP's sponsored books to gain more credibility in the countries concerned. The cultural endeavors of such intellectuals were directed toward translating and editing the titles approved by the FPP. And this policy, general policy, that people, non-communist leftists can also be utilized or be invited for the cultural diplomacy programs of the United States, is kind of common in other, and we can see the same pattern in other initiatives of the time, such as it has been studied in the case of the Congress for Cultural Freedom and its operations in, for instance, France. And we can see the same pattern there as well. The second structural rule was that the local manager of the FPP had to choose the books to be translated. However, only from a list of books.
Yes. I'm sorry to interrupt. You have less than 5 minutes left.
Okay, sure.
Thank you.
Sure, I will. Had to choose the books to be translated, however, only from a list prepared by the FPP, and this title selection process ensured that the book better suited the needs of the local market while providing an appearance of freedom of choice. And third, that the FPP was not a publisher. It had to prepare the book, translate and edit it, and then submit the final manuscript to be printed actually by a publisher, local publisher, and this ensured that there would be no competition between the FPP and local publishers. And due to the time limits, just to note that from the beginning, FPP wanted to also gradually move toward the publication of textbooks. However, it only would do that once it had consolidated its basis in a country through its regular translation program, and only in those cases that the Ministry of Education, National Ministry of Education, would cooperate with the local branches, which happened actually in at least 3 main programs: in Egypt for higher education textbooks, in Afghanistan for school textbooks, as well as in Tehran for school textbooks. And you can see on the slide 2 images regarding the textbook printing at Print House, as well as textbooks in Afghanistan published, sponsored by the Franklin Book Program. Another image of the distribution of their work in Bengali. And then moving just to briefly touch the case of Iran, the Tehran branch developed in the context of the close alliance between Iran and the US after the 1953 CIA-sponsored coup against Prime Minister Mossadegh. And it can safely be claimed that no national or international organization have had a comparable influence in Iran's publication and textbook writing. The works of operations of FPP, the Tehran branch, are so many. Just to list a few of them, they sponsored the establishment of offset printing house. You can see an image here. They work toward I have a list actually here, which would be helpful to just go through it. They translated more than 800 books to Persian, including the reprints. The number jumps to over 1,000. They sponsored the the establishment of the offset printing house, at the time the largest printing house in the Middle East. The Tehran branch published Afghanistan textbooks from 1957 to 1964, and after that, with the Kabul branch of the Franklin actually was founded and continued the job. They established Pocket Books Company, or GB, which was an attempt to distribute cheaper books for wider distribution and a kind of a mass distribution process. They produced and published paid magazines as bi-weekly supplementary reading materials. At the times, at some points, some of the only materials that could be read at the remotest rural areas in Iran. They sponsored workshops for publishers in the United States. I've provided some, details about these workshops and who were involved in the program for them, as well as the sponsored workshops for textbook writers in the United States. Both these sponsorships was financially funded by the foundation, and they provided loan and technical advice for establishment of Pars Paper Company. The success of the Tehran branch as compared to other FBP's branches can be best understood when we consider the close relations between the Tehran branch and the Iranian state. As after the 1953 coup, both the US and the post-coup regime in Iran were in need of a modern, far-reaching apparatus of production and distribution of bourgeois knowledge, and the land reform and the subsequent, and the two images here, you can see the Shah of Iran at the time and the Queen discussing certain titles in their visit to the Tehran branch. And the land reform and subsequent national literacy and educational campaigns were part of the capitalist policies supported by the US and embraced by the Shah that were intended to foster industrialization in Iran. The increase in oil prices in the mid-1960s enabled the Iranian state to financially assist these educational and publication policies. This revenue further allowed the Iranian state to use educational and supplementary reading publications to solidify the Pahlavi regime through the promotion of the Iranian state's official historiography and the celebration of the institution of the monarch. And just to conclude with this slide, an image taken by the very much celebrated Iranian photographer Kaveh Belistan, who passed away, unfortunately, as a war photographer, passed away in Iraq. By the late 1940s, the US leadership had to respond to an essential gap for its new imperialist role. US imperialism developed foreign policies in education that were ideological in order to solidify its political, cultural, and economic power, and to create an international socio-economic alliance primarily against communism. Consequently, the US developed a network of global and far-reaching cultural, educational, and knowledge production enterprises to influence not only Western Europe and the developed countries, but also those that reached out to the remotest rural areas of the Third World. One of the important instruments for winning the hearts and minds of people of the world during the Cold War was translation, production, and publication of reading materials, including textbooks and extracurricular teaching materials for children, youth, and adults. The FBP was a direct result of the Cold War, and its formation and activities were heavily influenced by the geopolitical and discursive developments of that era. Therefore, a comprehensive analysis of the FBP's origins, findings, goals, strategies, and principles requires a contextual understanding of the Cold War, the United States cultural diplomacy, and the geopolitical significance of each country where the FBP operated during this period. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. We're at time, so I think we may be able to take a couple of questions. Robin, I don't know if we have any online.
No, we do not.
Okay, there's one here in the room.
Hello. So thank you very much to all the panelists. My question was for Mahdi. My question about the Franklin Book Program in Iran was whether it was intended to sort of be the largest of the programs or to have this exceptional output from its inception, or whether that output was a product of its own initial success, if it started out similar to the other offices and then really took off because of how successful the program was in Iran. So thank you.
The earliest attempts were actually toward the Arab world. So we can see even the Cairo branch opened as the first branch of the Franklin Book programs. And the Cairo branch, we should not also neglect it's contributed a lot. So even in terms of its legacy, it translated more than 1,000 volumes, and it has had a huge effect on the history of publication in the Arab world in general as well. However, moving forward, after the coup, once the Tehran branch was established, even the documents in the Franklin Board of Directors, we can see that they at several points mentioned the name of Humayun Sanatizadeh as the first local manager of the Tehran branch because of his energetic and creative methods, in which enabled him, and the fact that he was very much well connected, that enabled the program to actually develop further in Iran. And Humayun Sanatizadeh was not only behind negotiations between the Tehran branch and Iran's Ministry of Education, through his close relations with the royal family, as well as especially with the Shah's twin sister, Ashraf Pahlavi. He was also behind the first, what they call historical, in their documents, historical moment when the educational publication of textbook in Afghanistan was actually negotiated, as he traveled to Afghanistan and had a meeting with the people of the Ministry of Culture through an invitation by the Point 4 officer in Afghanistan. So we can see that actually the closer alliance between the Iranian state and the United States in the aftermath of the coup definitely assisted, along with the creative and well-connectedness of the local manager there and the socio-political conditions there, very much assisted that certain office to become more successful, especially given the role that it could play in building contracts and agreements with the Iran's Ministry of Education, as well as the Anjuman Khadamat Shahanshahi, another foundation which at the time gave a lot of money to the projects, sponsored financially certain projects, especially in terms of publishing textbooks, printing textbooks in Iran.
Thank you. Those were some incredible images, too, you included in the presentation.
I would have just one comment for Blair and Jamila. We will have a discussion later today in the business meeting about documenting Palestine and change the subject and all of that. So your input will be very essential in these. Please stay and contribute to that. Thank you so much.
And I think we'll keep the few minutes that we have left to take a break and get some coffee. We'll be back at 10. Thank you very much again to all presenters.